The centerpiece of Christianity, that is, the resurrection, rests upon the crucifixion. Obviously, Jesus had to be dead in order to be raised from the dead. However, a claim amongst many, particularly Muslims, is that the crucifixion did not, in fact, occur. In this video, we will explore the evidence for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, aiming to establish a conclusion based on history, reason, and scripture. I assume that most of you are not searching for evidence within scripture itself. If you're a Christian, you already accept the crucifixion as a matter of fact. I'd hope so, at least. And if you're not a Christian, you probably don't consider the Bible as historically accurate. I would challenge you to watch this video in full. While I will emphasize external evidence, meaning outside of the Bible, we will begin with a brief examination of what the scriptures themselves say about the crucifixion and whether they are reliable and can be trusted. A brief analysis of the gospel accounts clearly establishes that Jesus Christ was in fact crucified and that he was subsequently killed by that execution. In Matthew chapter 27 verse 35, the author writes, "And they crucified him and parted his garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet. They parted my garments among them, and upon my vesture did they cast lots." Matthew goes further in verse 50 to say, Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. In chapter 19 verse 18 of the Gospel of John, it says, "Where they crucified him and two other with him, on either side one, and Jesus in the midst." Luke also writes, "And when they were come to the place, which is called Calvary, there they crucified him and the malefactors, one on the right hand and the other on the left." While I have only quoted from 3 of the 4 Gospels, all 4 Gospels clearly record narrative from their own individual perspectives, which, upon further investigation, clearly corroborate one another. It is the broad scholarly consensus, both Christian and secular alike, that date the Gospels from 60 to 100 AD, with Mark being the earliest, written anywhere between 66 and 70 AD, Matthew and Luke being a bit later, in the 80s of AD, and John being written anywhere between 90 and 100 AD. By historical standards, insofar as ancient documents go, the Gospels are considered to be written very close to the events which they record, and subsequently do not raise the red flags which are associated with a much larger chronological gap. In comparison, Alexander the Great died in 323 BC. The first thing that we have that is written about him, a biography, comes nearly 400 to 500 years later. Yet very few ordinary people would doubt the existence of Alexander the Great at some point in history or the events associated with him. You might be tempted to dismiss my references to the Bible by asking, isn't that just a biased religious book? Or, of course the Bible supports the crucifixion. The entire faith rests upon that fact. While this isn't a full-scale documentary and our time is short, I'd ask you to consider the New Testament not as a single religious volume, but as a collection of historical documents. The issue with this objection is that if we applied it consistently, we would very quickly encounter a significant issue, and, ironically, a bias on part of the person making this objection. Every author in history, since they are human beings, possesses biases about certain things. For example, Julius Caesar wrote his commentaries on the Gallic War with the intention of framing himself as a hero from Rome. To dismiss the crucifixion simply because the writers were biased believers, at least in some sense, is to basically be forced into deeming every other historical document we have as unreliable. Furthermore, such an objection usually just magnifies the person's own biases, as they are willing to scrutinize the Bible but not other texts. Thus, the real question is not, are these documents or are these writers biased, but are they reliable? Back to Julius Caesar. We base much of our knowledge on him to just 10 manuscripts. By comparison, that number is dwarfed by the roughly 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts, with over 20,000 more in other languages. While this doesn't automatically prove the claims within the text itself, it does establish something crucial. We can reconstruct the original text with unparalleled confidence. We aren't relying on a tiny, fragile collection of data vulnerable to corruption. Rather, we possess a mountain of evidence dated by historical standards remarkably close to the original events. Furthermore, the reliability of the gospel authors can be demonstrated in that they do not withhold potentially disadvantageous details. For instance, in Matthew chapter 26 verse 40 and 43, Matthew records that Jesus finds the disciples asleep, twice after instructing them to "Sit ye here while I go and pray yonder," and "Watch and pray, that ye enter not into temptation." It is very atypical for writers to invent stories or narratives which may portray them in a way which is disadvantageous or embarrassing. This is known as the criterion of embarrassment, a standard used by historians to judge the reliability of a source. The Gospels pass the criterion of embarrassment with flying colors. At this point, a critic might concede that the Gospel authors did in fact believe that Jesus was crucified, yet still argue that the crucifixion did not actually occur as portrayed in the accounts. Two theories are commonly proposed: the Swoon Theory and the Substitution Theory. Before moving to external historical evidence, we must examine whether either of these is plausible. The Swoon Theory proposes that Jesus did not die on the cross, but merely lost consciousness from exhaustion, blood loss, and shock. He then later regained consciousness inside the tomb and escaped. This theory encounters a variety of serious issues. It requires that we accept that the guy who had just been whipped with a flagrum, a device of torture that was comprised of multiple cords tipped with metal or bone, most likely exposing his muscles, tendons, and the skeletal structure of his spine would have literally been exposed, meaning that as he was carrying the crossbeam and as he was tied to the cross, splinters were literally rubbing up against his exposed spine, who then carried his crossbeam in that state, subsequently having nails driven through his hands and feet, who was then subjected to the arid Jerusalem climate for hours upon the cross, and then received a spear through his side, releasing water and blood, woke up in a dark tomb, unwrapped himself from his grave clothes, found the exit to the tomb, pushed the multiple-ton stone all by himself, overpowered or avoided the Roman guards, walked miles on feet that had just been pierced by iron sticks to locate the disciples who apparently thought that he was so healthy and alive that he must have rose from the dead. I think that even this brief analysis and scrutinization of the Swoon Theory realizes the numerous biological and natural issues with this claim. The second theory that is posited as an objection to the historicity of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is the Substitution Theory. As the name would suggest, it claims that a person was put in Jesus' place and subsequently crucified. It takes on two forms. We will dub Form 1 as the Human Substitution Theory and Form 2 as the Divine Substitution Theory. The Human Substitution Theory claims that a real person, someone who already existed, was misidentified as Jesus and crucified instead, while the Divine Substitution Theory claims that God intervened and caused someone else to appear identical to Jesus so that the person was crucified in his place, which is the version most commonly associated with interpretations of the Quranic statement in Surah 4 verse 157, which you saw at the beginning of this video. Both of these arguments are highly problematic. When it comes to the human theory, the objector would need to deal with the timing of the substitution, because the further the point of the substitution, the more difficult it becomes to justify it. If the substitution happened all the way back at Gethsemane, the critic would have to explain how Judas, who had walked closely with Jesus for approximately 3 years, misidentified the substitute as Christ. Moreover, they would then have to wrestle with the same issue when it comes to the other 11 disciples' misidentification of their Messiah. Also explaining events wherein the substitute behaves exactly like Jesus, such as the healing of the servant's ear. Furthermore, irrespective of the proposed substitution's timing, critics must account for misidentification, even by Jesus' mother and the Apostle John near the cross, as well as numerous other individuals, such as the Roman soldiers, particularly the religious authorities, and the crowds in Jerusalem. It becomes incredibly difficult to reason how the people who were closest to Jesus misidentified the substitute as him. There is also the aspect of behavior. If the authorities arrested and interrogated a random person accused of claiming to be the Son of God or the Messiah, the person could have simply just denied being that and having ever claimed to be that. The theory demands that the substitute be content with being executed for something he didn't do or claim to have done or be. Since a natural mix-up is virtually impossible, we must examine the divine substitution theory next, the claim that God miraculously disguised someone to look like Jesus. You must consider that it is almost always a Muslim who presents this idea, which means that we must be familiar with what the Quran teaches about Jesus, most relevantly that he was a prophet and not the Son of God, and that he was not crucified. I personally believe that this approach to reconciling Surah 4 verse 157 with history creates more problems for the Muslim than it actually solves. If God manufactured a perfect disguise so as to preserve Jesus' life, we then have Allah, who, insofar as Islam is concerned, is perfectly holy, intentionally deceiving the disciples, Jesus' mother, the religious leaders, and the entire Jewish and Roman world, and basically the rest of humanity, at least a large percentage of humanity. We are forced to conclude that Allah provided the exact catalyst that the Christian faith required. By tricking the earliest followers into believing that Jesus died, an event that the resurrection, as before discussed, obviously relies upon. The logical end of such a claim is that Allah authored the greatest historical deception in human history. When we reduce all of the evidence for the crucifixion to the Bible, it is already by historical standards overwhelming. However, if we extend our analysis to secular sources, the cumulative case for the crucifixion becomes virtually insurmountable. Perhaps the most notable source is that of the ancient Roman historian Tacitus. Tacitus was a hostile source to Christianity, meaning that he had no real reason to support the claims of the crucifixion. Yet in one of his publications, the Annals, wherein he records ancient Jewish history from 14 to 68 AD, he writes, "Therefore, to scotch the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men, loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christian. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius, by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. Therefore, we have a man who is dubbed reliable as a historian, documenting that Jesus Christ was executed under Tiberius Caesar by Pontius Pilate. Not only does this reference support the crucifixion, it would later bring the writer of the Gospel of Luke, Luke the physician, into question. In Luke chapter 3 verse 1 to 2, he provides a preface in order to place John the Baptist's ministry in context. Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and the region of Trachonitis, and Licinius the tetrarch of Abilene, Annas and Caiaphas being the high priests, the word of God came unto John the son of Zacharias in the wilderness. Excuse me for butchering those names. Notice how Tacitus specifically ascribes Pilate the title procurator, while Luke uses a broader Greek word, hegemon, which is typically translated as governor. For centuries, skeptical scholars used this precise discrepancy as a major reason to discredit Luke. Because Tacitus was widely considered the gold standard for Roman record keeping, critics claimed that Luke's differing terminology was basically definitive proof of either historical ignorance or evidence that the gospel was written much later by someone unfamiliar with the political structure of first century Judea. This apparent tension remained unresolved until a groundbreaking discovery in Cesarea Maritima, Israel in 1961. During excavations of an ancient theater, archaeologists discovered a damaged limestone block that was later named the Pilate Stone. The stone bears a Latin inscription dating back to the reign of Emperor Tiberius, which reads, "To the divine Augusti, Tiberium Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated." It's fascinating because while this semantic difference might seem insignificant, at first glance at least, it completely changed the academic consensus. The stone revealed that Pilate's actual contemporary title was the military rank of prefect, which in Latin was prefectus, rather than the title of procurator that was used by Tacitus. It demonstrated that Tacitus had actually committed an anachronism by projecting a 2nd century Roman title backward in time. But what about Luke? If the stone says prefect, doesn't that still make Luke wrong in using the term governor? Because Luke was writing in Greek, he used, as before mentioned, the Greek word hegemon, which is a broad umbrella term for a regional ruler or a commander. It functionally encompasses the military rank of prefect, which ultimately shows us that Luke was capturing history accurately, even in the minor details. And generally, authors, if they're attentive to the minor details of history, they are much more attentive to the major detail. Alongside ancient historians like Tacitus sits Mara bar Serapion, who, while seemingly holding nothing against Christians, was not one himself. The Syrian Stoic philosopher, in a letter written from prison to his son around AD 73, wrote, "What advantage did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as judgment for their crime. What advantage did the people of Samos for burning Pythagoras? In one moment the country was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God rightly avenged these men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, the Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of error. Nor did the wise king die for good. He he lived on in the teaching which he had given. The identity of this wise king is a matter of debate, and while we do not have time to delve headlong into that now, we can consider a striking parallel in the Gospels. All four accounts record the titulus Crucis, the inscription placed above Jesus' head on the cross, which ascribed him the title King of the Jews, a title Mara appears to be referencing here. A skeptic may object that Mara is simply writing a personal letter to his son and not aiming to capture history, but this actually strengthens the evidence. Mara is trying to exhort and teach his son a philosophical lesson. God punishes nations that murder their greatest thinkers and wise men. If his examples were not real, then his entire argument collapses, and the very point that he is trying to make has absolutely no ground. It's inconceivable to think that he would draw conclusions from fairy tales and then employ them in teaching, especially someone such as his son. It's far more probable that Mara looked at recent history, was convinced of its occurrence, and then used it to support his argument. Next on our list of hostile sources is this fine gentleman right here, Flavius Josephus, who was a 1st century Roman Jewish historian born in AD 37 in Jerusalem. He writes quite a bit on the Jewish War, as it's sometimes called, or more specifically the Jewish Revolt of 66 to 70 AD, I believe. In Antiquities of the Jews, 1863 to 64, Josephus records, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." It's critical to understand that scholars generally point out that 3 of the statements made in this extract from Antiquities of the Jews are not authentic Josephus, but most likely Christian interpolations. That basically means that the Christian scribe most likely looked at what Josephus had written and said, well, this is great and all, but I would like to make it a bit more fervent for the case for the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So I'm going to just change what it says. The first of these is seen in "if it be lawful to call him a man." We know that Josephus was a practicing Jew, and we see that throughout his writings. Therefore, it's inconceivable to think that he would basically borderline say that Jesus Christ may have been God, which would be blasphemy. And so for a 1st century Jew who did not believe that Jesus Christ was God, it's highly unlikely for him to say that Jesus Christ was possibly God. The next statement which comes into the firing line as a possible interpolation is that of "he was the Christ." Again, it's unthinkable that a practicing Jew would claim that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, which Jews fundamentally reject, hence his crucifixion, hence the fact we're even making this video right now. The last statement which scholars consider an interpolation is that of "for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him." For Josephus to accept the resurrection, it would mean he would not be a Jew, but he was a Jew after this point still. Nevertheless, the general scholarly consensus is that despite these later interpolations by Christian scribes, the core of this text remains authentically Josephus, meaning that it still holds historical value as an authentic testification to the crucifixion. Since Josephus was a Jew, it means that he was a hostile source, and since he was a hostile source, he had absolutely zero reason to testify to the fact that Jesus Christ was in fact crucified or to record that event as historical, which may not seem significant, but insofar as historical standards go, this delivers a major blow to any belief system which would claim something to the contrary, like we saw at the beginning of the video. Surah 4 verse 157 claims that Jesus Christ was not crucified, but that it was made to appear unto them. Now in this video we basically just did a very brief examination of the original sources which testified to the crucifixion and indirectly the existence of Jesus Christ. And while much unexplored territory remains, I think that it's very reasonable to conclude that Jesus Christ was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. And I would challenge you as well to go and do your own research and look into these sources and to examine your own biases. If you're confident about the historical figure of Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar and the events which surround them, then you have no reason to reject the crucifixion and existence of Jesus Christ, which is far better attested to than other events in the ancient world. Thank you for watching through to the end of this video. And in the videos to come, we will continue to examine some of the evidence for the crucifixion. There's a few other historical sources which are notable and significant in our discussion about the existence of Jesus Christ as a historical figure, and also the crucifixion of that historical figure. And we will also go on to examine the resurrection. As I said before, it is essentially the centerpiece of Christianity, and so the resurrection is what it all ultimately comes down to, that Jesus Christ rise from the dead. Because even if Jesus Christ existed, it's irrelevant if he didn't rise from the dead. Then he just existed, but he wasn't who he claimed to be, and Christianity collapses. After which we will return to the problem of evil, the moral problem, and surrounding objections and questions to Christianity and relating to Christianity.